Good to be with everyone again, and what a wonderful, awesome time already of sharing and intercession. And I just want to kind of again help us to kind of zoom out to the bigger picture of Isaiah 19 and what God is doing. Even the image of a threshing instrument, in my mind, it's useful to separate the chaff from the wheat, and it's not to just completely destroy what is growing, but it's meant to thresh and to separate. And I believe God is doing that in these nations of the Middle East, that there are wonderful believers in many of these nations, and there are people who are on their way to faith from various backgrounds, even Muslims who are going to be coming to faith in a harvest that's still to come. But then there are those who are just bent on absolute evil, and God is certainly using this situation with the war and Israel and the IDF to deal a real blow to the strong forces of Islamic fundamentalism, militant Islam in the Middle East. I agree with that. But for instance, in Egypt, we have over 10 million Christians. Most of those are cultural Christians, nominal Christians, but there are probably well over 1 million to 2 million evangelical or born again Christians from all different backgrounds, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. And so, what a mighty force within even the nation of Egypt to have so many Christians in the land of Egypt, and then and as well in Lebanon. Over 30% of the population of Lebanon is Christian background, and many wonderful believers there. And other parts like Jordan, there's a good percentage of Christians there, Iraq, Syria, all over the Middle East. So it's amazing to see what God is doing, even in the hearts of those Christians, to awaken them to God's plan with Israel. Many of them are on the journey out of replacement theology as God's dealing with them into an understanding biblically of his plan with Israel and the Jewish people. And so it's wonderful to see them praying for Israel, taking times to do extended worship and intercession in many cities around the Middle East, together in houses of prayer, churches praying for Israel. So I just want to continue on encouraging us that God is doing something as well in the hearts of many Middle Easterners to join with God's plan with Israel and the Jewish people in these last days. And I would just like to share my screen and quickly go through some verses again today. They'll help us with understanding his plan. And so we'll just look at and see this, that the nations of the Middle East will be joined together with Israel in God's kingdom as he comes to establish it on the earth. And he's doing a work there. Here's a map showing the nation of Egypt, as well as the nations under the umbrella of what we would call Assyria from Isaiah's day, and of course, Israel. And this is what Isaiah 19 speaks about, God's plan for these nations to become a blessing in the midst of the earth. And just to review this last few verses of Isaiah 19, in that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrians will come into Egypt, and the Egyptians into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. It's all about worship. What the Lord is doing in the hearts of believers is reconciling them to himself and to one another in his purpose to worship together, to come into a relationship reconciled as a family of God, and to worship the Father through Yeshua the Messiah. And we see that through the houses of prayer, the churches that are worshiping and praying. They're going back and forth, joining together in those cities, having conferences, worshiping together. Then it says there in verse 24, in that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. So Israel will be joined together with Egypt and Assyria as a blessing in the midst of the earth. What a wonderful promise and prophetic vision for the Middle East that Isaiah presents, and we can join and pray into that all the time until its fulfillment in these last days. And so that's the passion of our hearts with our ministry as we've worked throughout the Middle East and now together with ICEJ to encourage this relationship with Israel. But it's going to happen. I just want to focus briefly today on how God is going to bring this transformation to the nations of the Middle East. And it's happening primarily, as we read in Isaiah 19, through a great move of God that will take place in Egypt. And because of those large numbers of Christians, as well as Muslims who are coming to faith, there's going to be a real shaking taking place in Egypt that's going to result in a transformation of the nation of Egypt. In Hebrews, we understand this principle that was given actually to the prophet Haggai and reiterated in Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews says in verses 26 and 27 of chapter 12 in Hebrews, but now he has promised, saying, yet once more, I will shake not only the earth, but also heaven. Now, this yet once more indicates the removal of those things that are being shaken as of things that are made, that the things which cannot be shaken may remain. It goes on to speak about the kingdom of God will not be shaken, but will remain forever. So uh, I believe we're in those days. Things are being shaken in even the land of Israel, but in nations around that David shared with us about all the various conflicts and issues that are happening in the nations of the Middle East and actually all over the world. In Isaiah 19, uh, Isaiah was told and given this principle of how God is going to bring this change in the land of Egypt. It says in verse 22, and the Lord will strike Egypt, he will strike and heal it. They will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated by them and heal them. So there's this striking that will take place in God's final judgments and purposes to transform the land of Egypt. And that'll cause their hearts to turn to him and even cry out to him and entreat him for mercy, for deliverance. And he will rush in his love, power, and compassion to bring healing to the land of Egypt and bring Egypt to become his people. We even see this in Hosea as a reference similar to what's happening and may happen more in Israel as God is purifying the people of Israel. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. God's desire is for judgment, for strikings, these shakings to be redemptive, to turn the hearts of people to himself in all nations and among all peoples. I'll just briefly outline from Isaiah 19 the main points of these strikings of the land of Egypt. They're found in verses 1 to 15 of Isaiah 19, which starts with the burden against Egypt. And as we go through these points, you'll see at the end of this time today, just there's kind of a burden that settles on our hearts as we read and understand what God is doing and will do in the land of Egypt. It says he's going to move swiftly into Egypt to remove the idols of Egypt, those idols that have ruled over the land of Egypt, over the hearts and minds of Egyptians throughout history. Civil strife and conflict will occur in a widespread way all across Egypt, from city to city and kingdom to kingdom. Even families, brothers, and will fight against brothers. And this will dishearten the Egyptians. They won't understand why is there such conflict in our society. It says later in verse 4, cruel master and fierce king will rule over them. God will allow a very evil, cruel master to rule for a short time over Egypt to cause their hearts to turn to him, one who's even worse than the Islamic leaders they've had in the past. I believe it's a reference actually at the end to the Antichrist and his ruling over Egypt for a period of time. Then we go on, it says also in Isaiah 19 that the Nile River will dry up. Now, this has never happened in history, but it's going to happen at the very end of this age before Yeshua returns. It's mentioned also in Ezekiel 30 and Zechariah 10 that this will happen. So we know from all those prophets that this is a dramatic event in history that will take place before the kingdom of God is established on earth. And there's various purposes for that we don't have time to explain, but it's certainly going to shake the nation of Egypt and cause Egypt's economy to collapse because so much of their economy and their livelihood and even everything in the nation of Egypt is tied to the Nile River. So the whole economy will collapse, it says in that passage. And the pride of Egypt's leaders in the time of judgment and shaking that God will bring, their pride will not be able to help the nation of Egypt. It'll fail Egypt in that time. And so this is how those verses end up in verse 15, just in a very broken, disheartening state for the land of Egypt. Next week, we'll carry on from verse 16 and look at God's outcomes for what he's going to do in the land of Egypt and beyond to the nations of Assyria and together with Israel to bring this blessing forth in the midst of the earth. So I just want to highlight because I oftentimes, when I share this, like to look at the news and any current reports about the Nile River. This has been going on for some years, but Egypt is angry with Ethiopia because of a great dam, the Renaissance dam that they've built, and how it's retaining the flow of the Nile River from Ethiopia behind the dam and causing potentially the Nile to diminish in its water coming into Egypt through Sudan. So this is from September, just a few months ago in the news. It continues to be brought up in the news, and there's been times when Egypt even threatened to go to war against Ethiopia for building this dam and taking the Nile River water from its headwaters, from where it originates there, the Blue Nile in Ethiopia, and diminishing what would come to Egypt. We don't know if this is how the Nile River will dry up, but God says it will, and something to watch even in current events. So the effects of God's strikings upon Egypt, I'll just highlight these and conclude. The heart of Egyptians will melt with fear, it says in verse 1. The Egyptians will mourn, lament, languish, be ashamed, and be troubled of soul. That's all described in verses 8 to 10. So a great brokenness and mourning and disheartening will take place. It says in verse 14 that Egypt will be like a drunken man staggering at the time of God's judgments. So this is a difficult passage for us to go through and recognize that God has a determination to bring a brokenness and break down the pride of Egypt from its history, and even at times opposing God's plan with Israel, in order to bring forth a transformation, a changing of their hearts, and a turning to God, and a joining together with Israel in the kingdom of God when Yeshua comes. So next week, we're going to conclude with the outcomes and the amazing, glorious things God says he's going to do in Egypt, in the Middle East, and those nations of Assyria together with Israel. So thank you, Joshua. I'll just conclude there for today.